In this lecture video, we will talk about the first phase, that is requirements discovery. In the previous lecture video, we saw the 4 high-level activities of the requirements elicitation and analysis process. The different high-level activities were requirements discovery, requirements specification, requirements classification and organization, requirements prioritization and negotiation. We will talk about the different ways of discovering requirements in this lecture video. Requirements discovery, also called as requirements elicitation, is the process of gathering information about the required system and the existing systems and distilling or extracting the user and system requirements from this gathered information. Sources of information during the requirements discovery phase include the documentation about the system stakeholders, specification of similar systems, and so on. Stakeholders could range from end users of a system through managers to external stakeholders such as regulators who certify the acceptability of the system. In addition to system stakeholders, the requirements may also come from the application domain and from other systems that interact with the system being created and specified. All of these must be considered during the requirements elicitation process. You interact with the stakeholders through a wide variety of ways. That could be through interviews and observations, how the stakeholders uses the model of the system, and you may use scenarios and prototypes to help stakeholders understand what the system will be like. We will talk about interviews, observations, scenarios, and prototypings in the upcoming lecture videos. On the right hand of my screen, you can see the system stakeholders for the mental health care patient management system. These include patients, patients whose information is being recorded in the system, doctors who are responsible for assessing and treating patients, nurses who coordinate the consultations with doctors and administer some treatments, medical receptionists who manage patient appointments, IT staff who are responsible for installing and maintaining the system, a medical ethics manager who must ensure that the system meets current ethical guidelines for patient care, healthcare managers who obtain management information from the system, medical record staff who are responsible for ensuring that the system information can be maintained and preserved and that record-keeping procedures have been properly implemented. So these are the different stakeholders who are directly or indirectly affected by the system or use the system. Requirements will be discovered by talking to these stakeholders, by observing how they use the system, by giving them certain scenarios or circumstances and seeing what will be the outcome of the system, or by giving them a prototype or a model of the actual system so they can work with and say what other changes need to be done. These requirement sources, that is stakeholders, the domains, the application domain, and similar systems or the systems that the current system is interacting with, can all be represented as something called as system viewpoints. You should read the reading provided to you on viewpoints, and then you can thoroughly understand what viewpoints are. So they all can be represented as system viewpoints, with each viewpoint showing a subset of the requirements for the system. Different viewpoints on a problem see the problem in different perspectives or ways. However, the perspectives are not completely different or independent, but usually there is a lot of overlap between them. They have common requirements. So in this lecture video, we spoke about the phase of requirements discovery generally, what are stakeholders, who are system stakeholders, and how you can elicit requirements from these stakeholders. Next, we're going to talk about the first way of discovering requirements, interviewing. Formal or informal interviews with the system stakeholders are part of most requirements engineering processes. In these interviews, the requirements engineering team puts questions to system stakeholders about the system that they are currently using and the system that needs to be developed. Requirements are derived from the answers to these questions. Interviews can be of two types. First one, closed interviews. Closed interviews are the ones where the stakeholders answer a predefined set of questions like a survey or a questionnaire. Open interviews are the ones in which there is no predefined agenda. The requirements engineering team explores a range of issues with the system stakeholders and hence develop a better understanding of their needs. There is no predefined set of questions or a questionnaire which the system stakeholders will have to answer to. In practice, interviews with stakeholders are normally a mixture of both closed and open interviews. You may have to obtain the answer to certain questions which could be included in your closed interview, but these usually lead on to other issues that are discussed in a less structured way and not provided in a questionnaire as such. Completely keeping the discussion open ended will not work well. You usually have to ask some questions to get started and keep the interview focused on the systems to be developed. Interviews are good for getting an overall understanding of what stakeholders do, how they might interact with the system, and the difficulties that they face with current systems. However, interviews are not so helpful when it comes to understanding the requirements from the application domain. This can be difficult for two reasons. First, all application domain engineers or specialists use terminology and technical jargon that are specific to a particular application domain. It is impossible for them to discuss domain requirements without using this technical jargon because these are the exact technical terms that need to be used. They normally use this terminology in a precise and subtle way that is easy for requirements engineers to misunderstand. Another reason as to why interviews are not suitable for requirement elicitation from application domain is that some domain knowledge is so familiar and so obvious to stakeholders that they either find it too difficult to explain or they think it is so fundamental that it need not be mentioned. For example, a librarian, it goes without saying that all acquisitions of books have to be catalogued before they are added to the library. However, this may be not so obvious to the interviewer who is developing the system, and so it may not be taken into account as one of the requirements. The librarian may forget to tell this, assuming that that is a very fundamental thing to a library management software and will not be excluded by the requirements engineering team. Interviews are not an effective technique for eliciting knowledge about organizational requirements and constraints. This is because there are subtle power relationships between different people in the organization. There is a hierarchy of power. Most people are generally reluctant to discuss political and organizational issues that may influence and directly affect requirements. Now, what are effective interviewers? Effective interviewers are those who have these two particular characteristics. First, they are open minded. They avoid any preconceived ideas about the requirements and are willing to listen to stakeholders. If the stakeholder comes up with surprising requirements, then they are willing to change their mind about the system. Second characteristic of an effective interviewer is that he prompts the interviewee or the stakeholder in order to get discussions going using a springboard question, a requirements proposal, or by working together on a prototype or the model of a system. Saying to people, tell me what you want, is unlikely to result in useful information. They find it much easier to talk in a defined context rather than in general terms. Interviewing on its own is liable to miss essential information, and so it should be used in conjunction with other requirements elicitation techniques. In this lecture video, we have spoken about what are the different phases of the requirements elicitation process. We spoke about requirements discovery, and we also understood what do we mean by system stakeholders, and we also spoke on the first way or the first way of eliciting requirements, that is interviewing. We have also seen where interviews are suitable and where interviews are not so suitable or may not be effective in eliciting requirements from system stakeholders. We have also seen the characteristics of effective interviewers. And interviewing can miss essential information, so it cannot be used as a standalone technique for eliciting requirements. It is almost always used in conjunction with the other requirements elicitation techniques, which we will look in the upcoming videos. Thank you.